Hey, good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and welcome to another week of introduction to the built environment. This particular topic today that we're going to discuss today, or that I will deliver today, was supposed to be delivered last week, but we had a public holiday, and we're for the time being, we're still doing this class online because the current offline hybrid situation is a bit unclear. At least it's a bit unclear to me, with the matter of scheduling and such. So uh, for now, let's just keep things the way they are for the moment, and when we're ready to move to a offline or hybrid mode, then I will announce it to the class. So this week the topic or the discussion revolves around structures. Now, it's a bit difficult. It's a bit difficult to avoid. It's really difficult to avoid connotations such as artificial, synthetic, unnatural, or unreal, counterfeit, maybe, when we talk about structures, because, of course, um, other than caves, or cave dwellings, then all the other structures that we erect, um, as shelters and as places of activity, or as containers of activity, um, are usually are usually very unnatural. So structures are so we are here right now, in the third layer of the several layers of the built environment components. Um, and the building of structures establishes human and or social, environmental, and technical relationships, and constitutes a basic creative act, one that has occurred throughout human history. First, we used to live in caves, or our ancestors lived in caves. They were cave dwellers, and as um, as the population increases, they could no longer. They had to seek other forms of shelter, or maybe not seek, but rather provide different forms of shelter outside of caves. And so we continue to evolve and develop this craft of structure building. Um, and so buildings or structures is a primary adaptive design strategy for humans. And as a matter of fact, not only for humans, but also for animals, um, from insects to larger mammals. So this adaptive strategy is developed in order to live more comfortably, more effectively within the natural and the built environments. But but personally, I think, the further we develop our building capacity, our construction capacity, our creative capacity, I think the further away we are, or the more detached we are to um, the natural environment. But other than shelter, the act of building also expresses permanence. Um, Sometimes it even expresses cultural values. So structures, both inside and out, we already talked about the inside structures, or the interiors, a couple of weeks ago. Um, Structures can be defined as, as a structure where the contents of which are structures, or which is a structure is an agglomeration or a grouping of products and interiors that are humanly made or arranged. A structure is something that is created to fulfill human purposes, satisfying human needs, wants, and values. I mentioned to mediate the overall external environment, and the structures that we erect also affect the overall environmental context. So the context for structures include landscapes, cities, regions, and ultimately the earth upon which they're built. When we talk about structures, can we actually generalize them? Because there are many different types, there are many different reasons for them to be built. And to the best of my knowledge, the limits to what we can build it's only limited by our imagination. Can we generalize structures? I think it is really difficult to generalize about structures. They exist in many different types. There are structures that are old, new, crude. There are structures that are refined. Some structures express reasons why they were built. I think only human insights, interests, and imagination will limit the type of structures possible. Now, simply observing the built environment should enable anyone to list a variety of structures that serve individual and collective needs, wants, and values. Shelters, or the most basic structures, have been created in an enormous variety of shapes and sizes. And community structures accommodate cultural, commercial, governmental, educational, and recreational interests. If you look at, when we talk about structures, it's not just buildings, but also infrastructure such as bridges. So bridges, circulation systems like roads, dams, power plants, energy networks. They're all structures, and they are structured in. They are structures created to interconnect society in various ways. Now, the cumulative effect of building on or with the land creates larger components of the built environment. For example, a farmstead. Sure, farms seem like natural environments, but farms are actually quite heavily modified or quite heavily engineered. A campus, a neighborhood, village, or kampung, or city, even large metropolitan and rural regions are influenced by the way we collectively build and arrange structures, and perhaps wanting to be able to build and arrange these structures drove your or influenced your decision to study planning. Structures, namely buildings, have a unique and dual role in the built environment. They have the inside space and the outside space. I repeatedly mention this, but I can't stress this enough, that structures help to mediate between people and between both the natural environment and the surrounding built environment, creating a unique and dynamic relationship within the total built environment. Now, this dual role of designing both an interior and an exterior is not shared by other design fields. Exploring interior-exterior characteristics can expand the appreciation and understanding of structures and their human-environmental interrelationships within the natural and built environments. Now, why did I say that the role of designing both an interior and an exterior is not shared by other design fields? Well, when you when you're designing a house, you are not only thinking of you're not only thinking of the external natural environments, such as I need to mediate the climate. It's too hot, too humid. I need to design a house that can help me. That I need to design a house that has a cool interior, um, with enough natural lighting, and so on and so on and so on. But you're also considering the surrounding built environment. Do you have noisy neighbors? Do you have nosy neighbors? Do you have any neighbors at all? Do you have are you are you living next to what sort of activities do your neighbors conduct? Perhaps they have a shop. Perhaps they have a workshop. I know one of the neighbors, one of the neighbors that I in my previous in my previous neighborhood had a motorcycle garage um, in their garage, and when it would get so busy that they generate quite a bit of noise, and of course um, some degree of air pollution. So we need to take these things into account, not only the natural environment, climate, weather, the air, but also the activities and everything that surrounds our plot of land, or the land on which we will build our building. Now, internally, structures symbolize human spatial needs, wants, and values. Um, they creatively configure products and interior spaces in a variety of ways to support human needs and aspirations. Spaces for human activities are essential ingredients of a structure. Now, this internal characteristic is commonly referred to as the spatial or functional aspect of structures. Um, I chose this. I chose this particular. I chose this particular church or cathedral um, simply because that it offers a very unique experience when you're standing inside it, whether you're just visiting, or you're actually taking part in the rituals there. Why do I say it provides a unique spatial experience? Well, because when I mentioned Gothic churches and cathedrals with windows that are high above our heads, and that it symbolizes how humans are always humans are living in the dark, and that they are always trying to find a way towards the light, which is the heavenly or the divine light. Well, this particular church is obviously not a Gothic church, but if you look at the different shapes, sizes, and the different depths, how the architect placed the windows and the openings, they creating an interplay of light. So the divine light symbolism has been discarded and been replaced um, with this sort of mosaic, and it creates different degrees of lighting somewhat, and I don't know, it's an indescribable experience, but I think you get the idea when you look at it. When you look at the pictures provided. Now, in the exterior, in the exterior, in the exterior, sorry, um, the church itself is shaped, or taken, or the church itself takes inspiration from many different things actually, but one of the interpretations of its form that I particularly like is that it is in the form of two clasped hands, somehow the clasped hands that and the position that people assume when they are praying, so something like that, which to me is interesting. Other people have interpreted the shape in different forms. One of them that I heard is that it looks like a duck head, tail, um, tail or wing shape, and if you add a beak there. Other people said that it looks like a bishop's hat. I don't know what a bishop's hat looks like, but so the form in which it takes has been interpreted in many different ways, and I think the only way we can understand why it's shaped that way is to actually go and talk to the designer itself. Um, Externally, structures also provide and symbolize a protective envelope and an interrelationship with the outside environment. Now, this external expression is commonly referred to as the form of structure. The form becomes, in a sense, an enclosure that mediates the conflict between internal functional needs and the external environment. This enclosure forms the interior environment, which protects humans from the unwanted aspects of the exterior environment, such as uncomfortable temperatures, strong winds, or disruptive noises. Now, the enclosure can also open up to beneficial aspects of the outside environment, such as a garden, landscape, fragrances, fresh air, ventilation, natural lighting, even the sounds of nature, like water, birds, and well, if you have a neighbor that plays if you have a neighbor that plays instrument, then perhaps even music. The external enclosure can be considered closely analogous to to the skin, which also welcomes the sun's warmth, and our clothing provides insulation from the winter cold. Its pores, our skin's pores open to provide evaporative cooling in very hot temperatures. Our hair screens unwanted contacts while accepting the appreciative touch of a friend or a loved one. So the skin of a building can also be analogous to that. This particular house here that you're seeing is a house designed by architect Frank Lloyd Wright. It's called Falling Water. Personally, this is my favorite piece of architecture because because of its heavily cantilevered design, that makes it look like it's floating. It's not floating, but it gives that floating effect because of the lack of pillars or columns that hold up the cantilevered terraces and platforms. It was state of the art when it was built back in the 50s or 60s, but right now, if you look at it, you're probably thinking, well, there are a lot more fantastic structures out there. But again, this is a personal thing. In my opinion, the natural setting, it sits on a small waterfall by a stream, and the area surrounding the natural area surrounding the house. Seems to have been kept as close to the way they were prior to the building of the house. But all in all, yeah, it's my favorite, hands down. There's no other reason for it, actually. Now, human comfort, light, fresh air, optimum temperatures, etc., 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 is based on human senses and is provided either by natural means, through the windows for light and ventilation, perhaps solar energy for heat, some canopies for shading, for cooling, etc., or perhaps by artificial means, electric lights, electric or gas heating, air conditioning, etc. Designing without a full understanding of the advantages or the characteristics of the natural environment and the capabilities of built technologies could generally cause higher operating costs and higher rates of energy consumptions, and not to mention could also potentially risk your safety and well-being. For example, if you're if you're attempting a cantilever design such as this without knowing the capacity or without knowing the maximum width of a cantilevered concrete deck, you're thinking, oh well, a 10 centimeter deck would do it. I'm going to make this platform a cantilevered 20 meter something, with only 10 centimeters thickness. I can guarantee you that platform is not going to last. Once you take off the casting, it'll crumble, because, well, concrete doesn't work that way. You obviously need to reinforce it, and so on and so on. So without understanding those characteristics, those traits of the building materials that you're working with, then of course operating costs, perhaps your concrete deck will need regular maintenance. It keeps cracking for some reason, and then you'd have to patch it up again. And once you patch it up, it cracks somewhere else. You'd have to continuously patch it up. That's what I meant by higher operational and maintenance costs, and of course the safety and well-being bit where it crumbles or just breaks. And of course, energy and time. It's also energy and time consuming, because you have to conduct regular maintenance. Well, I'm not saying that if you build things properly according to specifications that it doesn't require regular maintenance. It's just that if you build it properly, it might take an interval of 20 years for maintenance. Whereas if you build it without knowing the traits and characteristics of the building materials that you're working with, then you're looking at a 5-year interval instead of a 20-year interval. Now, the external expression, the characteristics of form, also has a direct effect, even at times a major impact on the overall environment. Structures can be created to enhance or disrupt the landscape, disrupt the cities on which they stand, disrupt the regions in which they are built. Now, how structures fit into their context or adjacent environment is an important topic in studying the external form of structures. This is just an illustration. It's not something that is already built. If you're looking for something similar to this, I suggest you look, or you search Magic Mountains I suggest you search for Magic Mountains in Chongqing, which is similar to the picture that I've provided here. Now, whether this thing was built to enhance or disrupt the natural environments, well, we'll have to look at the entire context, of course. Perhaps the designers thought we would like to replicate the adjacent hills, or they could perhaps it could be that this type of structure was built into the landscape, and they're trying to maintain the form as close as possible to the natural form. So there are important quantitative and qualitative differences in the definitions of related terms. When we talk about structure, what do we mean by structure? Do we mean buildings? Do we mean architecture? Or do we mean something else? Well, a structure is something constructed. So an architecture is a structure. A building is a structure. Something constructed. A building, dam, bridge. Structure can also mean to arrange, to compose, or interrelate all parts to a whole. A building is a structure that is built, generally implying human occupancy. There's some activity in there, and perhaps to construct a building. Building as a verb is the art or the work of assembling materials into a structure. What about architecture? Well, the architecture is the art and science of designing and building quality open areas, quality structures, quality structures that foster communities and other artificial constructions or environments with attention to their aesthetic effect. But I think not just aesthetic effect. When I studied architecture, the way we would differentiate from architecture to regular buildings is not just an architecture is something that is elaborate or designed. No, but I did mention structures that foster, or buildings that foster communities, buildings that foster better interaction, better people-to-people interaction, better people-to-environment interaction. That's architecture. A building is simply, I'm putting this up, steel, concrete, glass, how many stories. It's got utilities in it. It works. It can support your activity, but that's pretty much it. It doesn't take into consideration how people interact inside those buildings, how people flow through a building, and so on. So that's what defines or differentiates or distinguishes the architecture discipline from other building or from other construction disciplines, such as civil engineering, for example. Civil engineers can build. They know a great deal more than architects about building materials and structures and how to put all these elements together. But they generally don't express cultural values and other intangible elements in their work. Now, this simplified timeline of architectural development and evolution, if you can see it clearly, demonstrates how ideas and trends tend to overlap and run concurrently. Now, many approaches are recycled. Many of them mature in later periods. In other cases, designers combine or fuse together multiple ideas in a more effective way to address human, social, environmental, and technological issues. So the study of past trends may, in up to a certain degree, allow us to predict trends in the future and understand the degree of maturity of the various approaches to architecture. Now, my teachers from our neighboring department, architecture, will be very disappointed in me if I don't feature local architecture in this lecture. And what better way to display our proud history, our proud legacy of architectural tradition, than to highlight their cultural significance. Now, the structures or the buildings, or I wouldn't say buildings, sorry, the architecture that are presented in front of you right now express different cultural values, express different cultural norms. And from the easternmost point of our nation to the westernmost point, we have a gazillion different traditions and norms, a gazillion different cultural values, all with its own significance. And so it is really difficult. It has always been a very difficult question to answer when people say, what is Indonesian architecture? Well, hey, this is just four of the thousands of the different forms of traditional architecture that we have on display, if you know where to look. Now, a substantial portion of the built environment includes, of course, structure, landscapes, infrastructure, and cities constructed by previous generations. And so these inherited artifacts provide a tangible record of the aspirations, technologies, and cultural values of human civilization. This particular settlement in Wairebu, for example, is a testament to the effectiveness of the machete as a cutting tool and the machete as a construction tool, because most of the components most of the components that are prepared for the houses or the huts. I wouldn't really call them huts because they're actually pretty large structures. But most of the components can be prepared using just a machete to cut and to cut and to smoothen out, and perhaps even to hammer in those components, to hammer those components in place. This is an ingenious approach, because this place is situated on the top of a mountain. So where the hell are they going to get their resources? How are they going to transport their heavy machinery and equipment? They can't. So they need to use as little tools as possible. And so the way the huts are constructed, the joints that they use and the tools that they use are very kept to a minimum, and so it's it's a testament to how our ancestors think, the way they think about the resources, the context that surrounds them, and the way they can use that to their advantage to create structures, of course. Current and future generations must make choices concerning how to treat historic buildings and neighborhoods. A small percentage of structures are revered for their association with famous persons or architectural achievements, and they should be protected from alterations. um, structures like rumah gadang can be are usually built for distinguished uh, for distinguished members of society, for uh, for ceremonial purposes perhaps, and the size of the house determines the degree of importance or your significance in that particular society. However, a vast majority of historic buildings are capable of being reshaped, adapted to suit the needs and aspirations of contemporary culture. Some buildings and neighborhoods will be recycled for new uses, while others perhaps will be replaced by new development. Um, at times where we often talk about where we often talk about reducing our impact or reducing our footprint, environmental impact, and then we look at these wood bamboo structures. We think that's extracting quite a lot extracting quite a lot from the environment. And to be honest, in my personal opinion, if we continue to build this way, then perhaps we would need to source. We would need to think of ways or better ways to conserve our forests. And so we continuously look for different materials, more sustainable materials, so that we can continue to build the way to build or to live the way we can continue to maintain our lifestyle up to a certain degree. But I think at some point, an original structure such as these may become less and less feasible to build due to material constraints, due to perhaps environmental constraints. I'm sure it's not due to technological constraints, because with modern day technology, we can easily build any traditional form of architecture. I'm sure, not just our traditional architecture, but also other societies who have traditional architectures with modern day building materials and technology. I'm sure we can easily replicate them. And speaking of which, when we talk about new development, it doesn't mean that our traditional architecture should be forgotten. We can maintain, if we can't maintain the materials, we can maintain their form. We can also maintain their cultural significance. For example, the rumah gadang approach that I mentioned, the size signifies or reflects your position in society, and such and such and such. We can still replicate that, albeit with newer materials, with more sustainable, with more energy efficient materials. And so you might be inclined to say that, but that's a very kitschy approach. You're just maintaining the shell, while not entirely maintaining the cultural significance or the cultural norms and whatnot. But at the end of the day, sometimes we need to look at these traditional. We need to look at these traditional architectures as well as simply as structures that serve a purpose. And if we need it to reflect our cultural values, then we need, and if we need it to reflect our cultural values, then perhaps it's the values that need to adapt to the current context. Historic places create cultural layers in the built environment, and they offer temporal dimension and they enrich the texture of our cities, towns, campuses, neighborhoods, perhaps, and our buildings. I'd like to tie this week's topic with the designer's responsibility portion of my lecture a couple of weeks back. This is the designer responsibility that I was talking about. We ask ourselves, what are the environmental impacts? Does it affect resources? Does it produce waste? Is it safe? What's the impact on human health and so on? But when we look at historic preservation, it doesn't really say what's the historic value, does it? So historic preservation is a form of responsibility. Historic preservation is an umbrella term used to describe the advocacy, research, planning, design, and construction activities associated with protecting historic structures and contexts. And most planners, architects, and interior designers will work with historic structures and contexts throughout their professional careers. I'm sure someday after you graduate from this institution and paving your way towards and paving your road, your professional planner's career, you will perhaps encounter issues with historic preservation. With historic items, you do need specialized knowledge to make appropriate design decisions concerning these structures. Now, historic preservation takes the form. There are three forms of historic preservation, as far as I know: preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation and adaptive use. Karina, who is right now in Canberra pursuing her PhD, should be able to elaborate a bit more on historic preservation, because that is her cup of tea. But this is historic preservation, as far to the best of my knowledge, as far as I know. Preservation, well, as the name suggests, means you're preserving the structure. You're trying to maintain it the way it is. You're trying to keep it the way it is. Usually there are several classes of historic preservation or historic buildings. So the highest tier or the highest category of historic buildings, the category 1 or the A category, means that you have to preserve the structure, you have to preserve its colors, you have to preserve its building materials, you have to preserve the building techniques. You can't change anything from that building. And why would a building be categorized like that? Because of its historic significance, perhaps. For example, the old Surabaya train station, or known as Stasiun Semut, that is a category A, or the highest category of that's the highest historic building category, which means that it should be preserved. However, the building is in heavy disrepair, and experts are struggling to research how the building used to look like. They research documentation. They search for documentation. They search for building specifications. They need to get every detail as accurate as possible, even to the point of sourcing the floor tiles and the floor and roof tiles from its original manufacturer in the Netherlands, which which is it's a huge undertaking for one building, but that building has a historical significance, so it should be preserved. Restoration, as the name suggests, the Samut station the old Surabaya station that I mentioned, that is an illustration of the restoration effort. But restoration can also mean bringing the old building up to current building standards or current building codes. So bringing it up to code. Perhaps the heating and ventilating systems in these old buildings are they may work, but they wouldn't be as efficient. They wouldn't be as energy efficient. They wouldn't be as effective if they were to keep the old machinery. So they need upgrading. So restoration can also mean upgrading older buildings, replacing the light bulbs with LED lighting and other more energy efficient appliances installed in the buildings. That's what restoration constitutes. Rehabilitation and adaptive use takes restoration one step further, where you can perhaps convert the building or a portion of the building for new uses due to modern day demands and such. In Surabaya, if you drive down through Darmo, you can see old buildings being replaced with new ones. You can see old buildings being rehabilitated and reused or repurposed to accommodate today's needs. Sorry. So a little digging a little deeper into preservation. Preservation as a design strategy involves taking actions to sustain the existing form. As I mentioned, you need to maintain, you need to keep it, you need to keep the existing form. Not only the form, but also the integrity, material of an historic property. In a sense, preservation can be considered an ongoing maintenance program. Change happens gradually and incrementally. Historic materials, which may be quite worn, they're maintained rather than replaced. Maintained to a degree, of course. When they can no longer be maintained and they need to be replaced. So that the wear and the aging process are visible. You can see that it's old, and they continue to convey a sense of time. For example, the original unpainted siding on a barn, or old glass in a storefront window, stained glass and such. Examples of places where preservation strategies are used to maintain structures for their intended purposes include, older barns, private homes, university classroom buildings, and perhaps even theaters. I think there may be a time where the rectorate building at ITS will be considered as a historic structure, and it will need preservation. During the life of most historic structures, modifications are made to accommodate changes in functional needs or stylistic trends. These changes may also assume historic significance in their own right. Now, the process of restoration is to bring a building back to a specific and significant point in time, usually to its original state, by accurately depicting the form, features, and character of the property as it appeared at a particular period of time by means of removal of features from other periods and reconstruction of missing features from the restoration period. Restoration processes may involve removing materials and layers of changes that have been made or added in order to clarify the original design intent. So any additional wings, any additional structures, gone. Or perhaps even any additional or any new architectural styles or association with a significant historic event or famous person. For example, if an old parliament building with historic significance, and then along comes a dictator and adds a new element to the building, thinking of making their mark on history, and then they did some atrocious thing. Think of Hitler. And then when they pass away, once that period is over, people think, we don't want that new addition because that was built by that particular person. So we'll get rid of it and restore the original parliamentary building, for example. Now, this picture that you're seeing here is a tragedy that struck one of the world's iconic architectural heritages, and it's a fire that destroyed the Notre Dame Cathedral. I would imagine the immense effort needed to restore the cathedral as historians, architects, engineers, and craftsmen scramble to accurately recreate the Gothic cathedral. I remember, I think, one of the interviews, they can no longer source the same wood used to construct the roof and the spire that burnt down, because that particular wood, that particular grain of wood has been extinct for the last 100 years or so. So they could, you might be thinking, oh, just put up a steel structure or something, but that could work, but that would reduce the historic value and the historic significance, and perhaps even up to the cultural significance of the cathedral, if such strategies or such approach is to be taken. Rehabilitation and adaptive use is the most commonly used historic preservation strategies. Rehabilitation is the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alteration, and addition, while preserving portion or features which convey its historical or cultural or architectural value. Rehabilitation usually involves preserving the original design and materials of an historic structure while making the alterations necessary to accommodate changes in function and or use. When buildings can no longer accommodate their original purposes, then they're often recycled for other purposes. Take this illustration, for example, Granville Island. Granville Island used to be an industrial estate. Industrial docks. It used to be full of factories, fish cannery, fish canning plants. But as time progresses, as the city of Vancouver evolves, Granville Island came into disrepair, and now they use Granville Island. They use the old structures in Granville Island, the old warehouses. They rehabilitated it, repurposed it, and used it to house markets and fresh food markets and some creative industries. Another example, which I forgot to put in here, is Darling Harbour in Sydney, where, like Granville Island, it used to be home to factories. It was highly polluted, but it's got a historic significance. Darling Harbour was a silent witness of the times of depression in the 1800s, I think it was, where the Great Depression, where people had lined up to queue for food and such. So now, like Granville Island, Darling Harbour has become a tourist destination where they have exhibition centres, and I think the ABC, the Australian Broadcast Channel, also has a headquarters in Darling Harbour. So, why is historic preservation important? What is the significance of historic preservation? The benefits of historic preservation is the benefits are multifaceted. Historic preservation processes help to preserve cultural continuity. It helps to protect neighborhoods, conserve energy to a certain point, because you're just reusing. You're only reusing. You're not actually building something new. You're reusing something, repurposing it, and so reduce, reuse, recycle. It offers us an opportunity to interpret historical events, to interpret history, reinterpret history, and enable people to experience the vitality and complexity of a multi-layered built environment. Now, every structure features materials that contain embodied energy, or energy that has already been expended and can continue to be harnessed. Now, the sources of embodied energy include energy used to manufacture original materials and transport them to job sites, as well as labor and energy used during construction. Embodied energy is usually lost through demolition. Instead, additional energy must be used for new construction to extract, manufacture, and transport new materials to job sites, build structures, and dispose of old materials in landfills. Now, preservation, by capturing this embodied energy on site, can be considered the ultimate recycling program. So, adaptive reuse. Don't build new things. Now, because mechanical support systems did not exist, historic buildings were frequently designed to use passive technologies, optimize access to daylight, and conserve energy. For example, school buildings, they generally had rectangular footprints with their long axis running east-west, affording generous access to high-angle or indirect daylight and ventilation through operable windows on the north and south-facing sides of the building. Now, the advent of mechanical systems and electricity enabled the designers to substitute natural or renewable energy sources for daylight and ventilation with energy-intensive artificial life support systems to regulate comfort for occupants. Think of artificial lighting, think of air conditioning. Now, their intentions often backfired because the impact of artificial substitutes on health, productivity, and energy consumption are being reconsidered in the design of contemporary workspaces. And historic buildings often can offer a paradigm for more effective design responses to climate. Historic components of the built environment also embody the hopes and aspirations of previous generations. They are living artifacts, affording opportunities for first-hand, tangible contact with history. For example, as students ascend the well-worn marble steps of their campus building, they can feel a connection to students who climbed those same steps hundreds of years ago, perhaps, before them, and to the traditions that help to forge institutional identity. Historic contexts provide cultural layers and experiential complexity that can't be replicated in new developments. Historic buildings also convey a sense of permanence and contribute to unique cultural heritage and regional identity of a community. They provide a tangible connection to a community's history. I think that is all I can deliver this morning. Was wondering if any of you might have any perspectives or any comments regarding historic structures or regarding structures. Have any of you seen unique or significant, culturally or historically significant structures throughout your life? Maybe you've traveled somewhere, you visited a place. Maybe one of you have even gone to Paris to see the Eiffel Tower, for example. And how did you feel when you see this old steel structure? Has anyone seen? It doesn't have to be overseas. It could be somewhere here. Have you visited a historic or a significant or a culturally significant structure? And while I wait for any of your responses, you can mark your attendance if you haven't done so already. How did you feel when you first visited the National Monument, Monas, for example? Or how did you feel when you first visited the Monument of Heroes, Tugu Pahlawan? Have you been in an old building? Yes.
For me personally, in a old building or architecture, maybe I feel like in a big building, so saya merasa kalau bangunan itu besar, jadi terlihat luas dan adem. Mungkin karena bukan fondasi, apa ya, kayak bangunan itu agak tinggi, kebanyakan bangunan-bangunan tua agak tinggi, jadi merasa agak rindang dan juga adem gitu setiap saya pergi ke tempat-tempat yang tua, historical building seperti itu, untuk saya sendiri. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for sharing. The of course the climate mediating effects that you felt. Oh, it's cooler in here because of it's cooler in here. It's the air flows better. It's because of the way that buildings were designed. The dimensions of the building, of course, higher ceilings allow for more air to flow. Into and out of the building, thus maintaining a degree of air quality. And if you look at old buildings here in Indonesia, most of them were built by the European settlers. If you look at the walls, they are usually pretty thick, maybe double the size of the walls that in your house right now, sometimes even more. That serves as insulation. Nowadays, you don't really need to build such thick walls. You can build normal walls and add insulation and other materials to help mediate and to help enhance thermal comfort inside new buildings. But I think thermal insulators here is not a common building material, and it's not a common approach. We build a house, for example. This is going to be hot. Put air conditioning in. Where if you care to explore insulation materials for your roof, for your ceiling, for your walls, you may actually achieve thermal comfort without needing energy-intensive appliances such as air conditioning. Of course, you may opt to install air conditioning as a backup, just in case that the temperature gets a little bit too high, and you might still need air conditioning anyways. But if you combine air conditioning and and insulation, you can actually achieve cooling a lot faster than you would without the insulation, and you can also retain the thermal comfort. So once you reach the desired temperature, you turn your air conditioning off. You can keep the room cool for longer periods of time with insulation rather than without. So again, the old buildings do convey this sense of climate mediation. The town hall, the Surabaya City Hall, is one good example of this thermal comfort feature. A couple of years ago, when I helped the city government when I assisted the city government with the preparation and the organization of the UN Habitat event. It took place in one of the meeting halls in the city hall, and what was unique about the meeting room was that it is situated. It has platforms or terraces on both sides of the hall, allowing for exposure to outdoor air, and the size of the windows. My goodness, those were some of the biggest windows I've ever seen, which lined the walls of the meeting room. And those windows were open, and we only had because there were many people inside, and there were a lot of electrical equipments, a lot of video conferencing equipments, which generated a lot of heat. But they didn't use air conditioning. They only used fans, and mind you, it's not big fans, just medium-sized fans. To cool down the Videotron equipment and to enhance airflow in the meeting room. And believe me, with all that equipment, with all that people in the room, those windows and the terraces did a wonderful job at keeping the thermal comfort bearable. I didn't even sweat throughout the event, and it was quite interesting. And it would be nice to be able to replicate that approach when building a house. So one day when you're building a house, make sure it is detached from your neighbors. That way it allows for better airflow around and through your house. Anyone else care to share their experience with not just historic structures, perhaps culturally significant structures, or perhaps perhaps one of you have encountered a unique building that makes you feel a certain way. Perhaps similar to the way I feel every time I see this building, for example. The pioneers of Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright was a pioneer of concrete construction. Most of his work involved concretes, and he likes to play with simple geometric shapes like this. So no fancy angles, no, just simple, a simple interplay of blocks. Now, sadly, I've never visited this. I've never visited this building, but yeah, hopefully someday, I could, or perhaps one of you can. And when you do, maybe you will feel the same way I do, or perhaps you have other stronger opinions towards it. Anyways, unfortunately, I've been called to another meeting pretty soon, which I need to prepare. So I think I'll leave it at that for the time being, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week. And should there be any changes in the mode of delivery of the course, whether we're going to go full offline or hybrid, I will let you know. Keep an eye out for any announcements in our classroom. Thank you everyone for joining me. Thank you Larimbi for sharing your experience with structures. I will see you all next week. Have a great day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you, sir.